What's up? Tonight's story is titled Probably the Most Intriguing Legal Guidelines and Punishments During the Victorian Technology. If this kind of storytelling helps you loosen up and fall asleep peacefully, please don't hesitate to love the video and subscribe to my channel. Also, feel free to let me understand in the comments the place you're listening from and what time it's now. If you happen to are in a position, turn off the lights and create a peaceful, secure atmosphere for yourself with the soft crackling of a fireplace in the historical past. Let's begin this exciting story. Chapter 13. Legacy of Victorian Laws and Punishments. Echoes in Trendy. Justice opening scene. A ultra-modern court docket reflecting the past at present's courtroom, with its digital monitors and formal attire, appears a ways removed from the few-lit courts of Victorian England. But, underneath the outside, echoes of Victorian laws, punishments, and legal philosophy still shape how justice is run. This final chapter explores how the Victorian era's elaborate and traditionally contradictory legal landscape laid foundations for modern regulation and society, a legacy still felt in justice programs all over the world. Part 1. Victorian Authorized Philosophy and Reforms. 1. The shift closer to rehabilitation. Victorian England wrestled with balancing punishment and reform. Early brutal punishments steadily gave method to correctional philosophies. The establishment of reformatories and juvenile courts pioneered recommendations of rehabilitation. The Victorian era planted seeds for state-of-the-art penology, emphasizing social reintegration to institutionalization and professionalization. Victorian interval. Notice the upward push of official police force is structured. Courts with clearer method specialized associations, like reform faculties and prisons. These institutional frameworks endure as the backbone of state-of-the-art justice. Part 2. Enduring authorized concepts and practices. 1. Policing and public order. The Metropolitan Police model became a blueprint. Global concepts of neighborhood policing, accountability, and crime prevention remain significant challenges of balancing authority with civil liberties persist. 2. Trial via jury and public trials. Victorian reforms made trials more available and public. Jury trials stay a cornerstone of many authorized systems. Transparency and public scrutiny have roots in Victorian court docket culture. Thus, media have an effect on and public opinion on trials are trendy challenges echoing Victorian occasions. Part 3. Punishment and prison reform. Legacy. 1. From corporal punishment to penal techniques. The Victorian decline of flogging and execution paved way for incarceration. Established punishment center of attention on prisoner reform and rehabilitation developed for the period of this generation. Prison systems trace structural and philosophical roots to Victorian associations to juvenile justice. Evolution. Victorian juvenile courts prompted latest separate systems for younger offenders. Emphasis on schooling, reform, and defense for juveniles is a lasting Victorian contribution. Section 4. Social justice and authorized equality. 1. Females is authorized rights. Victorian reforms commenced dismantling authorized disabilities of females' property rights. Custody laws and suffrage movements originated on this interval. These milestones influenced 20th century advances in gender equality before the regulation to the terrible and legal protections to debtors. Prisons and harsh poverty laws have been phased out. The Victorian generation highlighted the hyperlink between social stipulations and criminalist welfare, and authorized support systems grew from these concerns. Part 5. Reviews and controversies that persist. 1. Class and racial inequality. Victorian justice was once deeply category biased, with working classes going through harsher medication. The technology's imperialism shaped racialized authorized methods abroad, legacies of which precede modern-day justice systems grapple with these inherited inequalities. 2. Surveillance and state vigorous. Rise of policing introduced debates over privateness, authority, and state control. Victorian surveillance methods have advanced into modern-day surveillance states, raising civil liberty disorders. Part 5. Cultural affect and general memory. 1. Victorian crime in well-known tradition. Victorian generation crimes and punishments encouraged novels, movies, and television experies of Jack the Ripper, notorious trials, and prison memories captivate audiences. This cultural reminiscence shapes perceptions of justice and morality. 2. Education and ancient reflection. Working out Victorian legal guidelines aids in comprehending present-day legal challenges. Reflecting on this history encourages important views of growth and justice. Conclusion: a complex legacy. Victorian laws, lasting, have an effect on the Victorian technologies. Authorized and punitive programs embody the tensions of a society in transition between subculture and modernity. Punishment and compassion, manage and rights. Its legal guidelines and punishments, even as traditionally harsh through at-present requirements, helped form the framework for contemporary justice. As we proceed to adapt legal philosophies and associations, the echoes of Victorian England remind us of the significance of balancing order, fairness, and humanity in the ongoing pursuit of justice. Chapter 1: Shadows of the Empire. An introduction to Victorian justice. Opening scene: a foggy London morning, 1850. Think the creaking of carriage wheels on cobbled streets, gas lamps, solid flickering shadows onto soot-stained constructions. The bells of huge Ben echo within the distance as the city awakens. Amid the fog, a constable in a blue wool uniform faucets his truncheon against a wall, signaling his patrol down Fleet Street. In his pocketbook is a list of nuisances to document: a beggar asleep in a doorway, a lady accused of indecent conduct, and a chimney sweep boy lacking work. These should not simply social observations, their talents crimes. This is Victorian justice, great, intricate, and every now and then terrifying. Section 1: The making of Victorian legislation. 1. The age of Queen Victorian. The Victorian era, spanning 1837 to 1901, coincided with the reign of Queen Victoria, a time of unparalleled industrial, political, and social exchange. Britain used to be reworking. The population surged, cities exploded with new factories and staff, and the British Empire improved across continents. Alongside this progress came nervousness. Tips on how to govern a society in flux. The answer, at the least in the eyes of Parliament and the Crown, was law. Victorian legal guidelines had been shaped by a strong mix of morality, fear of social unrest, devout beliefs, and evolving attitudes about crime and punishment. The legislation was once obvious because the moral spine of society. As Britain built railroads, factories, and colonies, it also built a legal empire, inflexible, expansive, and deeply moralistic. 2. The influence of the economic revolution. Industrial revolution was once no longer just about steam engines and cloth mills. It changed the very constitution of society. Folks moved from rural villages to crowded cities like Manchester, Liverpool, and London. With this got here poverty, pollution, slums, and in the minds of the elite crime. Victorian lawmakers believed that urbanization bred immorality. Laws had been created to keep watch over the whole thing, from manufacturing unit labor to alcohol consumption, from vagrancy to prostitution. These legal guidelines by and large disproportionately unique the poor and dealing type. Part 2. The Victorian legal process. 1. The hierarchy of courts. The legal constitution in Victorian England was tricky. Petty sessions. Local magistrates dealt with minor offences, e.g., drunkenness, vagrancy. Quarter sessions treated extra severe crimes and appeals. Assize courts for essential crimes corresponding to murder, rape, and treason. Court docket of chancery and normal legislation. Courts, civil concerns. Condo of Lords acted because the very best court docket of appeal, except 1876. In apply. The magistrates' court docket was the place most persons had contact with the justice approach. Magistrates had been almost always wealthy landowners, not educated attorneys, yet that they had sweeping vigour. 2. The position of the policy area than the Victorian technology. Law enforcement used to be informal nighttime watchmen, regional constables, or volunteer corporations. However, in 1829, Sir Robert Peel centred the Metropolitan Police Force, a reputable, uniformed police service. The Victorian policeman, traditionally called a bobby or peeler, grew to be a logo of order. He used to be both feared and respected, even as his presence helped cut down special crimes. It also sparked controversy. Many working-class humans saw the police as sellers of elite control, instead than protectors of public welfare. Part 3. Crime and Morality. 1. Crime. As a moral failing Victorian, society considered crime no longer simply as a legal offence, however, as a moral failure. To break the regulation was once to defy God, household, and Queen. This moral lens influenced sentencing. Theft, for instance, might be punished severely if it used to be visible because the effect of idleness or drunkenness. For ladies and kids, crimes of sexuality, like prostitution or illegitimacy, had been criminalized and stigmatized ways more harshly than crimes of violence. The concept of ethical contagion intended that a lady running the streets could be arrested on suspicion alone. 2. The panic over the detrimental courses. As urban poverty grew, Victorian elites developed a fear of the harmful courses, the negative, the unemployed, and people residing in slums. The legislation grew to become an instrument for social management. Laws like the Vagrancy Acts and the Negative Law Modification Act punished the homeless and jobless, pushing them into workhouses or jail. Even minor infractions, like loitering or promoting fruit and not using a license, could influence in penitentiary time. Part 4. Punishments and Public Spectacle. 1. The role of public executions. Early, within the Victorian period, public executions had been main spectacles. Hundreds and hundreds gathered to witness hangings outside Newgate Jail. Providers offered souvenirs, preachers screamed about sin. The condemned had been sometimes under the influence of alcohol, hysterical or defiant, but these movements usually turned into galas of violence. Reformers began to impeach whether or not public executions really deterred crime. In 1868, they were abolished in England, relocating executions behind jail walls, a shift from public spectacle to state-sanctioned silence. 2. The usage of corporal and capital punishment. The Victorian justice process employed a large variety of punishments. Putting, used for murder, treason, rape, and except 1837, even for stealing a handkerchief. Flogging and whipping, common for men and boys, mainly executed in public. Transportation, criminals sent to penal colonies like Australia until the apply ended within the 1860s. Pillory and stocks, used earlier, but phased out through mid-century. Solitary confinement, fashionable in the new prison philosophy. Isolate the crook. Force repentance. Section 5. The upward thrust of the jail method. 1. A new philosophy. Reform via isolation. Victorian prisons had been laboratories of moral reform, influenced by religious beliefs and Enlightenment pondering. Reformers believed that criminals would be rehabilitated by way of silence, labor, and prayer. The separate procedure popularized in Pentonville Prison forced inmates into 23 hours of solitary confinement a day. They wore masks when external their cells to hinder ethical infection. The result? Many went mad. 2. The silent approach. More approach used to be the silent approach, where prisoners worked collectively, however, might not speak. Violators had been punished with meals, deprivation, or beatings. Prisons grew to become bloodless, bleak, and terrifying, designed to interrupt the spirit. Despite the rhetoric of reform, the true intention used to be, by and large, deterrence. Prison used to be supposed to be so terrible that no person would dare return. Section 6. The class divide. Injustice. 1. Justice for the wealthy. Justice for the terrible. In Victorian Britain, wealth could buy leniency. A rich man caught committing fraud could pay a first rate and return to his property. A poor woman stealing bread could be dispatched to jail for months. Security attorneys have been rare and often unaffordable for the negative. Trials could be over in minutes. Inquests and evidence were oftentimes brushed aside, absolutely, if the accused came from a reduced category. 2. The phantasm of fairness. Despite the growth of the police and the courts, justice used to be deeply unequal. Judges and juries had been normally biased with the aid of type, race, and gender. The legal reforms of the technology helped, however, slowly, and quite often best after public outcry over miscarriages of justice. Part 7. Conclusion. A. Legal process constructed on morality and warithip. Victorian authorized method used to be a strange combo, modern day and medieval, moral and merciless. It mirrored the anxieties of an empire in transition, fearful of rebellion, determined to instill order, and obsessed with appearances. Victorian justice was now, not in simple terms about crime and punishment, however about enforcing an imaginative and prescient of society, orderly, hierarchical, Christian, and obedient. In the following chapters, we will delve deeper into precise areas of this legal labyrinth, from the remedy of females and youngsters, to the bizarre laws that ruled day-to-day existence. The history of Victorian law is not virtually statutes and judges. It is about human lives caught in the equipment of justice, for better or worse. Chapter 2. The Moral Computer. Crimes of Decency and Public Order. Opening scene. A girl in silk and a whisper in the crowd. London, 1862. A good-dressed girl, no older than 30, walks briskly down Regent Avenue. Her corset is tightly laced, her gloved arms clutching a folded fan. Two men tip their hats, but one whispers to the opposite. There goes a fallen woman, that you could constantly inform. Inside minutes, a constable presiges her. He questions her presence on the street. She is accused of soliciting, even though she has mentioned nothing unsuitable, dedicated no crime, and has no prior file. Nevertheless, she is arrested. Within the eyes of the regulation, her presence, look, and femininity had been suspect enough. This chapter is ready, how morality grew to be legislation, and how decency was once enforced, now not simply by way of the courts, however, by way of surveillance, suspicion, and fear. Section I. The upward push of the moral code. 1. A nation obsessive about respectability. To comprehend moral crimes in the Victorian generation, we have to first realize Victorian morality. The age was once defined by a paradox: public prudishness and confidential vice. Respectability was once the whole lot. A person's status determined their situation in society, mainly for ladies. This obsession ended in the enforcement of laws that punished now not just actions, however appearances and impressions. What mattered was how a character regarded, behaved, and presented themselves in public. Disintended laws were created and interpreted with a watch toward maintaining the general public ethical order, ordinarily on the cost of the marginalized. To the ethical laptop. Policing habits. Victorian cities had been filled with watchful eyes. Constables, magistrates, employers, landlords, clergy, and neighbors. Everybody used to be a part of the pleasant moral computer, an informal but powerful community that judged behavior and suggested indecency. To the regulation, people could be arrested for making use of profane or blasphemous revealing or inappropriate garb, loitering in distinct areas. Above all, women near theaters or taverns, public displays of affection such as kissing in public, cross-dressing, or gender non-conformity. Part 2. Prostitution, soliciting, and the fallen lady. 1. The prostitute, as an emblem of decay. Prostitution existed across Victorian cities, but it surely wasn't seen in simple terms as a financial dilemma. It was a moral situation. The prostitute symbolized societal cave-in, sickness, sin, and the corruption of Christian values. But the law rarely pursued the men who bought sex. As an alternative, it criminalized women with vague legal guidelines. Soliciting, quite simply speaking, to a person on the avenue might be visible as an attempt to solicit prostitution, being a long-established prostitute, a loosely outlined term, used in police stories to criminalize repeat offenders, most often without proof of precise transactions. Loitering with intent, a different, indistinct accusation used to arrest females who looked out of location. 2. The Contagious Diseases Acts 1864, 1866, 1869, among the most stunning moral legal guidelines of the technology. These acts allowed police to detain females suspected of prostitution and discipline them to forced medical examinations for venereal illnesses. If found infected, they have been detained in lock hospitals for months. These laws did not observe to men the intent to safeguard the well-being of soldiers and sailors. Women grew to be disposable in the identifier of countrywide force. The acts have been met with fierce opposition. Social reformer Josephine Butler led a powerful crusade for his or her repeal, arguing that they legalized sexual violence and turned ladies into state property. The legal guidelines were ultimately repealed in 1886, an infrequent victory for Victorian feminists. Section 3. Legal guidelines of language and conduct. 1. Profanity and blasphemy. Swearing in public was unlawful, notably close churches, schools, or in earshot of females and kids. Blasphemous speech might affect an imprisonment or fines. Blasphemy legal guidelines had been enforced now, not just on the streets, however, in publishing. Obscene literature, even scientific texts about sexuality or contraception, would be banned underneath obscenity laws like the Obscene Publications Act of 1857. Books by way of authors, equivalent to Charles Knowlton, and even translations of classical literature were censored or destroyed if deemed immoral. 2. Public shows of in public, that would be punished via a nice couples would be arrested for indecent behavior just for sitting too close on a park bench. In a single documented case from 1873, a young couple were arrested in Hyde Park for exchanging repeated gestures of affection, which included maintaining palms and hugging. The judge called it a public affront to Christian decency. Section 4. Garb, Identity, and the Legislation 1. Past dressing and gender legal guideline Esther have been no explicit countrywide laws banning cross-dressing in Britain. However, local ordinances and normal legislation interpretations typically criminalized it as indecent publicity, impersonation, or public mischief. Several excessive profile arrests, including Ernest Bolton and Frederick Park in 1870, shocked the nation. These men, who dressed as females and carried out in public, have been accused of conspiring to commit sodomy. Though ultimately acquitted, the case highlighted society's deep nervousness round gender and morality. 2. Trend as a authorized marker. Bad ladies carrying garb above their station had been oftentimes arrested for impersonation or accused of being prostitutes. A lady sporting a corset and silk gloves perhaps accused of trying to pass as a woman. Above all, if she was once obvious in a public house frequented by men. Part V. The working class below. Watch 1. The legit poor. V's. The immoral poor. Victorian. Lawmakers distinctive between the deserving terrible folks who labored hard and confirmed deference, and the immoral terrible, these deemed lazy, loud, or unruly. Ethical legal guidelines had been more often than not used to control the behavior of the working category. Loud arguments between spouses would be known as demanding the peace. Singing or taking part in instruments in the road without a license was once unlawful. Gathering in organizations of greater than 3 persons, exceptionally at night, used to be grounds for suspicion. 2. Alcohol and the temperance motion. Public drunkenness was once one of the most of the time punished ethical crimes. The 1872 Licensing Act gave police large powers to arrest anyone intoxicated in a public place. The temperance movement, led by religious corporations like the Salvation Army, campaigned for tighter alcohol restrictions. They saw alcohol as a gateway to sin, certainly for women, who have been believed to lose their ethical compass underneath its influence. Section 6. Punishments for ethical crimes. 1. Fines, imprisonment, and public shame. Punishments for moral offenses have been most of the time designed to disgrace the culprit. Public whipping, usually for guys, used to be nonetheless practiced early within the period. Fines had been usual, especially for working category offenders, which might outcome in imprisonment if unpaid. Brief prison sentences, more commonly in brutal stipulations, were exceeded down for minor infractions like obscene language or loitering. 2. And moral correction for ladies and women deemed immoral, above all those arrested for prostitution or immorality. There have been precise reformatories and rescue houses. These had been section jail parturition, designed to redeem ladies through labor, religious instruction, and surveillance. Punishments typically included tough labor, laundry, stitching, cleaning, mandatory Bible readings, silence for hours, unfinished weekly moral inspections by using clergy. Part 7. Resistance, repeal, and reform. 1. The function of reformers. No longer everybody accepted this ethical machinery. Writers like Charles Dickens criticized the hypocrisy of an approach that punished the poor for behaviors the wealthy indulged in secretly. Activists like Josephine Butler, Elizabeth Fry, and Octavia Hill labored to dismantle essentially the most oppressive parts of the process. Their efforts ultimately resulted in the repeal of the Contagious Ailments Acts, improved jail stipulations, and a public rethinking of morality and the regulation. 2. Changing attitudes through centuries. Finish. B. Means of the late 1890s, British society used to be transferring. Science, secularism, and modern-day psychology had been difficult, devout moral codes. Literature and artwork pushed boundaries. The Oscar Wilde trials of 1895 shocked the general public and highlighted how dangerously ethical law would be weaponized. While ethical crimes were still prosecuted, there was once developing unease concerning the harm they prompted, no longer just to the accused, but to justice itself. Conclusion. The invisible prison of respectability in Victorian Britain, the regulation, reached a long way beyond crimes of violence or theft. It ruled hearts, minds, appearances, and desires. The regulation enforced silence in public, compliance in females, and self-erasure in any person who didn't fit the milieu. For many Victorians, in particular the negative females, and those who broke gender or sexual norms, everyday existence was once a constant efficiency of respectability under danger of punishment. This is the proper vigor of the moral laptop. It didn't handist punish folks that broke the rules. It compelled everybody to live in worry of appearing to do so. Chapter 3. The Negative Man's Crime, Vagrancy, Begging, and the Workhouse Procedure Opening Scene. A frost-bitten morning, Whitechapel, 18 for 5. It is a freezing dawn, in certainly one of London's most destitute districts. A man huddles below a threadbare coat, external a butcher's save. He has not eaten in days. The keep owner, disgusted through the man's appearance, calls a constable. Inside minutes, the person is arrested for vagrancy, charged no longer with stealing, no longer with threatening habits, however with the crime of present whilst bad. As he is marched off to detention centre, a crowd of onlookers mutters. Some pitied him, others conveniently flip away. He's considered one of countless numbers, victims not of criminal intent, but of a brutal authorized method that treated poverty itself as a punishable offence. Part I. The criminalization of poverty. 1. Poverty as against the law in Victorian Britain. The line between destitution and illegal activity used to be dangerously thin. While industrialization created enormous wealth for some, it left many more at the back of unskilled, unemployed, and unprotected. Rather of being handled with compassion, the terrible were most commonly seen as morally suspect. The notion took root that poverty used to be the result of laziness, drunkenness, or sin. Hence, many laws didn't aim to alleviate the poor, however to manipulate, confine, and punish them. The 19th century British state made poverty illegal. In follow, if no longer in word. 2, vagrancy laws, and the label of rogue, the Vagrancy Act of 1824, handed just before Victoria's reign, was once a turning factor. It gave sweeping powers to police to arrest idle and disorderly persons, rogues and vagabonds, suspected persons or reputed thieves. These terms had been intentionally vague. A man or woman would be arrested conveniently for drowsing in the open, begging, or loitering, and not using a seen manner of subsistence. The legislation didn't require proof of criminal pastime handist. The suspicion that any person could commit a criminal offence. It was preemptive justice, rooted in fear. Part 2. Begging as an authorised offence. 1. Road begging and legal consequences. The Victorian government saw beggars as a nuisance and a risk to public morality. Policemen have been steered to clear the streets of them, especially in affluent areas. Those caught had been most of the time fined or imprisoned. Examples of punishable acts incorporated: soliciting for meals or money, following folks down the streets, singing or performing for coins without a license, youngsters to beg, even the act of showing negative dirty garments, tattered boots. An unkempt appearance was generally adequate to convey suspicion or costs. 2. Children and begging colleges. Hundreds of thousands of street children roamed Victorian cities, many orphaned or abandoned. Some laboured in gangs, but most comfortably begged to survive. Authorities created begging schools, institutions designed to do away with children from the streets. On paper, these were charitable endeavours. In practice, many have been harsh disciplinary facilities, where youngsters were overwhelmed, overworked, and taught to worry authority. For the state, baby poverty was once now not a social failure. It was once a discipline main issue. Section 3. The Poor Legislation and the Workhouse Procedure. 1. The 1834 Terrible Legislation Amendment Act. This act modified how the British state handled poverty. Its imperative principle used to be the inspiration of much less eligibility. Aid would only receive 2 people who entered a workhouse, and conditions inside had to be worse than the lowest paid job external. The purpose: to deter people from seeking public aid, except certainly vital. This law with ease made searching for help a punishment. 2. Inside the workhouse, a jail in cover workhouses have been purported to offer refuge and sustenance. Really, they had been grim associations. The place inmates had been stripped of dignity, loved ones, and freedom. Stipulations included families separated by using intercourse and age gruel, or meagre foods manual, labor, breaking stones, selecting oakum, silence and obedience, normally dehumanizing, uniforms and numbers, imposition of names. Some workhouses even had mortality charges, higher than local prisons. Being admitted to a workhouse carried a lifelong stigma. Men and women have been obvious as failures, morally unworthy of pity. Section 4. Average charges and sentences for the terrible one. The rate of being broke the legal procedure imposed fines for virtually every minor offense: drunkenness, public urination, swearing, littering. The terrible mainly couldn't pay. The result? Imprisonment. In Victorian courts, a few of the negative had been sentenced, not for what they did. However, considering that they couldn't pay the cost of forgiveness, a person fined 5 shillings for sound asleep in a park could spend 14 days in prison when he failed to pay. This cycle repeated eternally. 2. Hard labor for the desperate. The poorest prisoners, most likely charged with begging, loitering, or vagrancy, were assigned tough labor in prison. This might incorporate treadmills, dittoning, oakum pulling, apart historical ropes, stone breaking, turning the crank, a pointless, painful computer. These punishments broke bodies and spirits, a system designed to humiliate poverty into submission. Section 5. The photograph of the unworthy bad. 1. Victorian attitudes towards the bad. Philosophers and lawmakers divided the negative into 2 classes: the deserving, terrible, widows; the elderly, or disabled, these visible as victims of fate; the undeserving, terrible, capable-bodied guys; and women who had been unemployed or homeless. The latter group was once viewed with suspicion. Newspapers, sermons, and politicians painted them as knowledge criminals, drunkards, or seducers. They were not seen as people to support, however, threats to be neutralized. This ethical judgment was woven into legislation. 2. The position of faith and charity. Charitable associations, many run by means of churches, offered some relief, but charity more often than not came with stipulations: day-to-day prayer or church attendance, signery, Bible study. Proof of ethical worthiness. Individuals who were noticeable as drunk, promiscuous, or defiant were turned away, although ravenous. Even philanthropy grew to be an ethical scan. Section V. High-profile circumstances and public reactions. 1. Real reports. Real suffering. Countless numbers of courtroom documents from the Victorian era report heartbreaking experiences. Sarah T., age 11, sentenced to 7 days difficult labor for begging outside a bakery. Thomas C., a conflict veteran, arrested for vagrancy after sound asleep in a church porch. Margaret W., pregnant and homeless, sentenced to a workhouse. The place, her child, died in infancy. These weren't criminals within the traditional feel. They were victims of an unforgiving process. 2. Reformers and critics. Converse outwriters like Charles Dickens used their work to criticize this injustice. In Oliver Twist, Difficult Times, and Bleak Condo, Dickens uncovered the cruelty of workhouses and the hypocrisy of Victorian charity. Other activists, like Lord Shaftesbury and Annie Besant, lobbied for authorized reforms, better stipulations, and protections for the unemployed. Their work slowly converted public opinion, though primary authorized changes wouldn't come except the early 20th century. Part 7. The Worldwide Face of British Poverty. 1. Colonial impact and Irish famine. Refugees. Victorian England's poverty concern used to be additionally world. Many vagrants in British cities had been Irish refugees, driven from their place of origin by famine and colonial forget-about. They have been traditionally treated with contempt by using authorities and the public. Their accents, clothing, and customs marked them as outsiders. Irish immigrants have been disproportionately arrested under vagrancy, legal guidelines, and subjected to the worst workhouses. 2. Exporting the negative to the colonists. British government used emigration as a strategy to poverty. Poor kids, females, and men had been many times compelled or coerced into leaving for Canada, Australia, or South Africa, supposedly for higher opportunities. Truly, many were used as low-cost labor or domestic servants, arriving without resources or protection. The negative weren't just punished at dwelling, they have been shipped off to be negative somewhere else. Conclusion: poverty is a legal entice in Victorian Britain. To be bad used to be criminalized, surveilled, and discarded. The legislation seen the destitute not as victims of an unequal economic system, but as threats to moral order and urban cleanliness. Vagrancy, legal guidelines, the workhouse process, and the brutal punishments meted out to the homeless disclose a society obsessed with punishing weak point alternatively than addressing its roots. And yet, the bad persisted. Some fought again, others survived in silence. Their lives, documented in court records and jail ledgers, tell a story of quiet resistance and an approach that broke more than it constant. Chapter 4. Ladies and the Law, Gender, Purity, and Punishment. Opening scene. A gavel falls in silence. 1858. In a dimly lit London court, a woman stands alone earlier than accused. Her crime, infanticide. The courtroom whispers in scandal. She is unmarried. Her organization dismissed her upon studying. She used to be pregnant. She gave delivery by myself in a tenement, and the youngster died hours later. She swears it was stillborn. The judge calls her a monster. The jury takes 20 minutes. She is sentenced to dying. Her identity is lost to history, but her story was once a ways from targeted. In Victorian Britain, women lived below a legal and ethical procedure that judged not most effective their movements, however their gender, advantage, and conformity to a rigid ultimate of purity. In the eyes of the law, to be feminine used to be, as a rule, to be suspect. Part 1. Victorian Ideals of Womanhood. 1. The angel in the condo. Victorian society held up the determiner of the angel in the residence, a pure, obedient, domestic girl whose role was once to serve her husband, carry children, and provide ethical guidance. Females have been expected to be chaste before marriage, agitated, and passive after marriage, obedient to their fathers, husbands, and the regulation deviation from these ideals, whether by means of alternative or with the aid of misfortune, could influence in harsh authorized and social penalties. 2. Legal identity and patriarchy. Legally, a married woman ceased to exist as an impartial character. Beneath the doctrine of coverture, she had no separate rights. She would now not own property. She might no longer enter into contracts. She would not sue or be sued. Her youngsters belonged to her husband's simplest in the late 19th century, with the Married Ladies' Property Acts 1870 and 1882. Did these legal guidelines to change? Except then, a woman's physique, labor, and legal identification had been easily her husband's property. Section 2. Criminalizing female sexuality. 1. The fallen woman, and the regulation in Victorian legal concept. Female advantage was once synonymous with legal innocence. A woman accused of any crime involving sexuality, from prostitution to infanticide, used to be judged, now not simply by what she did, but by what she used to be assumed to be. A girl might be imprisoned for soliciting or being labeled an original prostitute, dwelling with a man out of wedlock, having kids, external marriage, alleged indecency, or lewd habits. The burden of proof in many instances rested on a lady's popularity and look as a substitute than any concrete evidence. 2. The crime of infanticide. Of the tragic ordinary legal circumstances in Victorian Britain was infanticide, the killing of newborn children, by and large through unmarried mums. Poverty, disgrace, and the risk of social ostracization led desperate ladies to commit desperate acts. Others were harmless, blamed for traditional toddler deaths in hazardous residing stipulations. In lots of circumstances, the mummy gave birth by myself. The youngster died shortly after the mummy buried or hid the body. She used to be found out, and prosecuted. Infanticide carried the loss of life penalty, although many sentences had been commuted or changed by imprisonment after public outcry. Part 3. Prostitution and state control. 1. The double regulars mentioned in Chapter 2, Victorian law criminalized the act of prostitution, however, hardly ever punished the customers. Females have been blamed for seducing men into sin. Guys were excused for his or her weakness. The Contagious Diseases Acts 1864, 1866, 1869 gave police the power to arrest women suspected of prostitution and force them to bear scientific assessments for venereal ailment. These laws were unapologetically gendered. Most effective females had been demonstrated, utilized without trial or warrant, used to target bad females in garrison towns. The laws sparked the primary predominant feminist resistance action in Britain. 2. Josephine Butler and the Battle for Dignity. Josephine Butler, a middle-category feminist and Christian reformer, led a nationwide campaign in opposition to the Contagious Ailments Acts. Her platform used to be progressive. It is not the purity of men that is verified by way of these legal guidelines, but the patience of women under legalized brutality. Butler's activism published a actuality on the heart of Victorian justice. Purity was not a virtue equally demanded. It was a weapon used to manage ladies. The acts were repealed in 1886, but the stigma persisted. Part 4. Home violence and legal blindness. 1. Marriage. As possession, Victorian wives were legally subordinate to their husbands. Men might legally demand sex from their wives. Marital rape used to be now not criminalized. Bodily discipline them within undefined reasonable limits. Confine or lock them in the house. Ladies had little legal recourse until their lives have been in threat, and even then, the legislation offered few protections. Divorce used to be almost impossible. Before the Matrimonial Factors Act of 1857, best Parliament would supply a divorce, a system only the wealthy could find the money for. 2. The rule of thumb, and the court's inaction. Thor apocryphal. The rule of thumb. The thought that a person would beat his wife with a stick no thicker than his thumb mirrored the informal leniency courts showed towards abusive husbands. Police more often than not refused to intervene in home matters. A girl who filed complaints may be mocked or neglected, to obey and forgive, blamed for frightening her husband's simplest extreme circumstances. Where a girl was once severely injured or killed, drew real legal attention. Part 5. Women. Within the Doc 1, when females committed crimes, laddies charged with violent crimes, murder, theft, arson confronted double judgment. For their crime and for their failure to be female, courts reacted harshly when ladies deviated from the submissive norm. Feminine murderers have been described as unnatural, monstrous, demonic. The press sensationalized feminine criminals like Amelia Dyer, the notorious youngster farmer who killed babies in her care. Dyer's 1896 trial grew to become a media frenzy, a warning to all immoral women. Yet ladies usually committed crimes out of desperation, abandoned by using society, punished by means of the regulation, and pushed beyond their limits. 2. Female thieves and the gender hole in justice. Petty theft used to be the most long-established crime dedicated via females, stealing food, garments, or household objects. These women had been mainly negative, single or widowing to care for children. They had been sentenced extra, as a rule, than guys to prison faculties, female-handed prisons, or transportation to penal colonies. Punishment used to be not often rehabilitative. Reformatories emphasized home talent, suing and cooking, devout indoctrination, obedience, and silence. Part 6. Ladies in jail. 1. Conditions in female prisons. Males in Victorian prisons lived underneath strict manipulate. Feminine guards oversaw strip searches, labor, laundry, stitching, cleansing, necessary silence, typical inspections. The concept was to correct habits, not simply punish. However, this traditionally intended breaking the spirit of inmates. Kids born to imprisoned mothers have been taken away. Pregnant prisoners gave birth in chains. Some women gave birth and buried their babies inside the partitions of the tuition. 2. Elizabeth Fry and Reformer. Elizabeth Fry, a Quaker reformer, used to be one of the crucial first to campaign for humane therapy of feminine prisoners. She encouraged for women guards for ladies inmates, entry to devout steerage and education, smooth living conditions, normal dignity in confinement. Her work led to some changes, above all in large prisons like Newgate and Holloway, but many smaller jails remained brutal and degrading. Section 7. The battle for legal rights. 1. The Married Ladies' Property Act's primary, most important step towards legal equality came with Married Ladies' Property Act, 1870, allowed women to keep gains after marriage. Married Ladies' Property Act, 1882, gave married females manage over all private property. These laws converted ladies from authorized dependents to individuals, at least on paper. 2. The upward thrust of the ladies' rights movement by of the late 19th century. Women have been organizing for broader reforms. Entry to education, custody rights over kids. Right to vote no longer granted until 1918. Authorized recognition in courts. Figures like Millicent Fawcett, Emmeline Pankhurst and Barbara Bodishin carried the torch, combating to reshape a procedure designed to discipline females, now not shield them. Conclusion. Justice in chains of gender in Victorian Britain. The law was once, now not, blind. It was once patriarchal, moralistic, and selectively cruel. Ladies have been punished no longer just for crimes, but for stepping external the strains society drew for them. The authorized approach judged their purity, policed their bodies, omitted their suffering, and most often refused to hear their voices. And yet, despite the chains, Victorian women fought again. They resisted, survived, and reshaped historical past, laying the foundations for the freedoms many experience at present. Their legacy reminds us that justice need to be fought for, no longer easily granted, and that the legislation without compassion or equality can turn out to be the very crime it claims to oppose. Chapter 5. Youngsters of the Court Docket, Juvenile Crime and Correction. Opening vignette. The boy within the dock. London, 1867. A thin boy, no older than 10, stands trembling earlier than a justice of the peace. His crime, stealing a loaf of bread. The courtroom smells of damp timber and ink. The boy has no advice, no loved one's reward. He's sentenced to 3 years in a penitentiary, his name recorded alongside hardened criminals. He weeps silently. His name, Thomas Culver, one in all hundreds of thousands of kids processed by way of the Victorian justice system. A method that noticed in young offenders, now not innocence lost, but knowledge threats to order. Part 1. Child, and a legislation, a broken replicate. 1. The invention of childhood. Within the early Victorian era, childhood was not seen as a protected, harmless segment of lifestyles. Children, peculiarly these from working type or impoverished backgrounds, had been considered as miniature adults' employees or future employees. Moral threats, if unsupervised, were few. Authorized distinctions between little one and grown-up offenders, except mid. A 7-year ancient might be tried in and grown up, caught imprisoned with adults, sentenced to rough labor. The thought of juvenile delinquency emerged most effective step by step, and even then, it was once extra about social manage than compassion. 2. The age of criminal responsibility. Legally, the age of criminal accountability in Victorian England was set at 7 years. Historical. A baby might be determined guilty of theft, arson, even homicide, so long as it might be confirmed they understood proper from fallacious. This resulted in chilling instances corresponding to a 9 to 12 months historical girl hanged within the early 1800s for stealing kids, beneath 12 being sentenced to transportation to Australia. Capital punishment for youngsters declined in use. Its danger loomed over the poorest and most prone section. 2. Crime, poverty, and survival. 1. Road kids and urban chow-through. The mid-19th century. Industrialization and urbanization swelled Britain's cities. In London, on my own, thousands of youngsters lived on the streets, most likely orphans or deserted by way of families who would not have enough money to feed them. They survived by begging, stealing meals, coal and clothes, working as mudlarks, crossing repairs, or chimney sweeps, conducting youngster prostitution or petty fraud to the higher courses. These youngsters weren't victims, they have been a public nuisance, a hazard to ethical order. 2. The upward thrust of the dangerous courses. Victorian elites feared the emergence of a criminal classification, a term that traditionally integrated poor, homeless, and vagrant kids. The clique fueled hysteria with reviews of youngster gangs pickpocketing, rings younger burglars, expert through older criminals. This resulted in a wave of punitive reforms designed not to rehabilitate, but to include the perceived toddler criminals of day after today. Section 3. In the courtroom, how little one's circumstances were treated. 1. Abstract justice and swift sentence. Kids accused of crimes were normally processed in summary courts, fast relocating, casual hearings wherein they traditionally lacked representation, parental aid, figuring out of costs or rights. The goal was once discipline and deterrence, not rehabilitation. A average sentence for a 101 months historical thief may be 14 days in jail, adopted by means optra 5 years in a penal complex or industrial institution. 2. Extraordinary cases of Victorian baby Justice Sarah Jacob, age 12, died in 1869 after being starved for the period of a religious fasting experiment. Her moms and dads have been convicted of manslaughter. Edward Jones, known as the boy intruder. He many times broke into Buckingham Palace as a youngster. He became a media sensation and was once imprisoned multiple instances. Mary Jones, aged 14, hanged in 1831 for stealing a coat. Her case triggered a scandal and resulted in extended public outcry. Section 4. Reformatories and industrial schools. Prisons in Conceal. 1. Reformatory schools for convicted youngsters. The Youthful Offenders Act of 1854 offered jail where children observed responsible of crimes had been sent after serving part of their sentence in jail. Stipulations included strict discipline, eminal labor, farming, tailoring, shoemaking, devout guideline, isolation from family. Some reformatories had been run with compassion, others operated like militarized work camps. 2. Industrial faculties for Achan's kids, situated by way of the Industrial Schools Act of 1857. These faculties particular orphan students, uncontrollable kids, as outlined with the aid of mum and dad, or police kids not but convicted but deemed prone to offend, at the same time designed as preventative institutions. Industrial faculties nonetheless used corporal punishment, fickle labor, psychological coercion. Many cases, these schools grew to become warehouses for the bad, locking children away for years, centered on classification prejudice. Part 5. Transportation and Little One convicts, a broad one. Youngsters sent to penal colonies. Exit the 1860s. Probably the most original punishments for kids, chiefly repeat offenders, used to be transportation to Australia or different British colonies. A child as young as 10 might be sent abroad for petty theft of a grantiationshire with a gang to voyage was once perilous. As soon as they have been indentured to work on farms or in houses, regularly dealing with abuse and isolation, although bought as an impossibility for reform by means of labor. Transportation was a state-sanctioned exile, a approach to cast off challenged children from sight. 2. The end of transportation ended for juveniles within the 1860s, largely because of public protests over cruelty. Rising bills of deportation, miving colonial labor, desire shuva, the philosophy behind it, that youngsters have got to be eliminated, disciplined, and corrected by way of isolation, persisted in domestic associations. Part 6. Reformers and critics of teeny bopper. Justice 1. Charles Dickens, the voice of compassion. Few authors influenced public opinion on child justice as powerfully as Charles Dickens. His novels, mainly Oliver Twist and Bleak Apartment, uncovered the cruelty of workhouses, the corruption of the legal method, the hypocrisy of a society that punished the poor, even as excusing the rich. Dickens also individually visited prisons and reformatories, writing concerning the need for youngster unique rehabilitation. 2. Mary Chippy and the start of youngster reformary. Woodworker, an educator and social reformer, was a leading voice within the production of voluntary reformatory as correction. Juvenile courtesy believed in ethical training over punishment, advocating for kindness, vocational schooling, Christian instruction, reintegration into society. Her work laid the basis for the cutting-edge juvenile justice approach. Part 7. Altering the regulation, gradual development. 1. Juvenile Offences Act 1847. This regulation allowed children underneath 14 to be tried in separate courts from adults, although in practice this used to be, as a rule, disregarded. 2. The Reformatory Colleges Act 1854. This enabled magistrates to sentence youngsters immediately to reducing the usage of prisons, a modest however principal shift. Point 3. The Fundamental Schooling Act 1870. By making college attendance compulsory, although not but free. This act slowly lowered child crime by means of retaining kids off the street, supplying general literacy and morality instruction. De lingua structure in the course of childhood and college attendance for working-class children was once inconsistent and most often overridden with the aid of the needs of labor. Part 8. The legacy of Victorian juvenile justice. 1. Lessons from the prior Victorian Britain started out the gradual method of recognizing that kids usually are not comfortably small adults. However, this shift took decades and hundreds and hundreds of younger lives. By the late 19th century, some positive factors had been made. Separate associations for juveniles, a action toward rehabilitation, extract humane attitudes in regulation, yet the legacy remained elaborate. The equal method that situated reformatories additionally created a pipeline from poverty to jail. 2. Echoes in latest justice to present. A few of the challenges first confronted in the Victorian technology stay important. How must society manage young offenders? What position does poverty play in crime? Will punishment or prevention be the priority? The Victorian age offers both warning and steerage, a reminder that justice for kids have to be rooted in understanding, now not fear. Conclusion. Childhood on trial in Victorian England. Childhood might be a crime. To be younger, bad, and in the improper location on the mistaken time used to be to risk being swept into a system that noticed delinquency as disorder and punishment as therapy. However, amid the cruelty, a brand new suggestion slowly grew that children would be guided, knowledgeable, redeemed. The juvenile justice process, born within the jails and reformatories of Victorian Britain, continues to adapt, and its basis, for higher or worse, used to be laid by judges, reformers, and the kids who bore the load of a damaged law. Chapter 6: Crimes of the Intellect, Madness, Asylums, and the Criminally Insane. Opening vignette. The Girl in White England, 1852. A young lady is dragged through the gates of Bethlehem Royal Clinic, her wrists sore. She screams, claiming she isn't insane. Candace angry at her husband for taking her inheritance. A surgeon marks her case file with the phrase, hysterical delusion due to uterine ailment. She will on no account depart. This was once no longer distinctive. In Victorian England, madness used to be each authorized class and a social weapon, used to get rid of, silence, or punish individuals who didn't conform. Above all, women. Part 1. Understanding insanity within the Victorian mind. 1. Madness. As moral fallowith in the 19th century, madness was once normally considered not as a scientific situation, however, as an ethical or non-secular failing. Causes were believed to include devout doubt or overzealousness, betrayed masturbation, emotional trauma, disobedience, specifically in women. Medical professionals, often called alienists, and lawmakers viewed madness to be curable by way of self-discipline, order, and morality, a point of view that profoundly shaped legal guidelines and treatments. 2. The authorized definition of madness. The Manhattan Ideas, 1843, centered the typical for legal insanity in Britain. A defendant would be declared no longer responsible by means of cause of madness if, on the time of committing the act, the get-together was once laboring beneath this type of defect of intent, as not to recognize the character and grade of the act he used to be doing. This definition involved in knowledge of proper and unsuitable, no longer intellectual sickness as we comprehend it today. The ruling sparked excessive debate. Would someone be mad and still legally accountable? The influence used to be a flood of recent legal guidelines, institutions, and courtroom controversies. Part 2. Asylums, prisons of the mind. 1. The rise of the Victorian Asylum, the County Asylums, Act of 1808, and subsequent acts resulted in the construction of hundreds of thousands of public and exclusive asylums throughout Britain. Via 1850, there have been greater than 100 asylums. Many overcrowded. Thousands of persons were restrained for causes ranging from actual intellectual health problem to unwanted behavior. Asylum populations doubled every decade too. What obtained? You dedicated common symptoms or motives for institutionalization. Integrated melancholia, most often postpartum depression or grief hysteria, trapple term for women expressing anger, ambition, or sexual independence. Ethical madness, behaving immorally or socially inappropriated delusions, too much prayer, or claiming to hear divine voice. And married pregnancy, political agitation, or radical belief. Factually, anybody, exceptionally a lady, who challenged authority or violated social norms risked being declared insane. Section 3. Women, insanity, and the law. 1. The gendered analysis as ladies have been identified with intellectual ailment at disproportionately high premiums. Victorian medication tied feminine psychology to reproductive well-being, particularly the uterus. Conditions like hystereoclimacteric mania, menstrual insanity ... have been used to justify confinement, sedation, or pressured institutionalization, ordinarily without trial or recourse. Point 2. Marital vigor and incarceration. Dawn Victorian regulation. A husband might commit his spouse to an asylum with simplest a health practitioner's signature and a few physicians' accredited bribes. Some chilling examples. A lady who learned novels obsessively was once dedicated for intellectual instability. A wife who resisted sex used to be deemed frigid and mentally unbalanced. 1. Other, who puzzled her husband's infidelity, was locked away for jealousy. Brought about mania. These abuses were not rare, they were systemic and commonly authorized. Section 4. The criminally insane, between crime and insanity. 1. Courts and madness. Please, Victorian courts needed to come to a decision. Was once the defendant mad or just evil? A responsible man would receive execution or penal servitude. Person judged criminally insane, perhaps restrained for existence in a specialized asylum. Some feared the madness plea was once a loophole. Others saw it as humane development. Famous cases: Daniel Manhattan 1843, believed he was once being persecuted by way of the government. Killed the top minister's secretary, found insane. His case shaped British regulation permanently. Edward Oxford 1840, attempted to assassinate Queen Victoria. Found insane, later launched to Australia, sparking outrage. William Wyndham 1861, tried for eccentric behavior, carrying gaudy clothes. Speaking surprisingly, the trial grew to become a media circus on the limits of intellectual freedom. 2. Broadmoor Crook Lunatic Asylum opened in 1863. Broadmoor grew to be Britain's primary institution for the criminally insane. It housed murderers judged insane, politically hazardous, however mentally sick. Contributors profile feminine lunatics. Conditions have been higher than prisons, however nonetheless harsh. Inmates had been sedated, remoted, and located continuously. They underwent non-secular guide and labor remediescape. Used to be almost unattainable. Part V. Remedies from the curious to the cruel. 1. Restraints and isolation in early Victorian asylums. Therapies most commonly integrated: straitjackets and chains, solitary confinement, loadless baths, blistering and bloodletting. These had been believed to shock the mind again to rationale or purge excess power. 2. Ethical medication revolution. Mid-century reformers like Dr. John Connolly promoted ethical treatment, which emphasized humane care. Smooth environment. Snow bodily restaurants. Regis and occupational healing asylums began to resemble structured communities. However, cure remained patronizing and controlling. Nonetheless, ethical medication did violence and gave birth to today's psychiatric ethics, albeit inconsistently applied. 3. The silencing of females. Remedies for females more often than not integrated sedatives and opioid childbirth to revive hormonal stability, atarically or hysterectomy to do away with hysterical impulse, bloodlettless water healing to subdue sexual or emotional expression. These interventions have been hardly ever curative. They have been punishments for deviation from Victorian norms. Section 6. Public fascination and media scandals. 1. The asylum in literature and news. Victorians were obsessive about madness. Newspapers protected asylum escapes, superstar sufferers, and criminal insanity circumstances. Popular fiction echoed these fears. The Woman in White, via Wilkie Collins, a lady wrongfully imprisoned in an asylum. Jane Eyre, by way of Charlotte Brontë. Facets: the madwoman within the attic. Bertha Mason, Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, a critique of split personalities and moral duality. These studies blurred the line between crime, identity, and madness, issues deeply rooted in actual existence. Injustice. 2. Whistleblowers and ex-possessum journalists and former inmates exposed asylum abuses, experiences of overcrowding, sexual abuse, and physical violence. Letters from patients, detailing overlook and wrongful confinement campaigns, calling for third celebration reports and authorized protections. These experiences influenced Parliament and the public, pushing toward higher oversight and reform. Section 7. Reformers, doctors, and the C1. Pioneering doctors. Joe advocated for non-restraint care at Hanwell as Dr. Forbes Winslow pushed for compassionate psychiatric therapy and higher forensic diagnosis. Dr. Henry Maudsley helped. These men laid the groundwork for latest mental wellness care, though their recommendations had been regularly resisted or corrupted. 2. Legislative reforms. Key legal guidelines commenced shaping a better procedure. Lunacy Act of 1845 required all asylums to be inspected. Introduced Patient Registers. County Asylums Act 1853 inspired public asylums to curb reliance on prisons. The Idiots Act 1886 first strived to distinguish mental sickness from developmental disability. Way of centuries finish. Britain had a clearer distinction between criminal activity and intellectual ailment, although still deeply improper. Part 8. Legacy and reflection. 1. Lasting have an effect on Victorian laws and institutions. Created a few of the foundations for in these days' intellectual health systems. Legal madness definitions. Psychiatric hospitals. Forensic criticus. But rights, debates it, their legacy is darkened by means of sexism, classism, and cruelty. 2. Madness and power. Madness within the Victorian era was about more than ailment. It was about vigor to silence a woman, power to control the peronogy, to exile dissent, vigor to rewrite fact with the general practitioners. Penicillums, some distance from being sanctuaries, were in most cases instruments of the state and family to enforce conformity. Conclusion: who decides who is mad? In Victorian England, madness lived within the court docket, the asylum, and the residence. To be labelled insane used to be to lose control of property, freedom, and identity. But slowly, from inside these walls of silence, exchange emerged. Reformers fought for justice. Doctors wandered old models. Writers gave voices to the unvoiced. The historical past of madness in the Victorian era just isn't almost medicine. It is a mirror reflecting how society punishes what it fears, and in that replicate, even at present, we can still see ourselves. Chapter 7: The Gallows and the Guillotine. Capital punishment in the Victorian Age. Opening scene. The crowd gathers Newgate Prison, London, 8 a.m., April 1849. Hundreds of thousands stand shoulder to shoulder. Avenue companies shout, promoting pies and gin. Youngsters climb rooftops. The condemned, Frederick Mon, is ended in the scaffold. He's faded but silent. As the noose tightens, a hush falls. A moment later, the trapdoor opens. The crowd erupts. This was Victorian England, where justice was public spectacle. Punishment used to be swift, and the noose was once law. But behind the gallows stood a tricky approach of evolving legal guidelines, controversial reforms, and societal debate. Section 1. The inheritance of blood. Capital punishment. Earlier than Reform 1, the bloody code. Within the 18th century, Britain had over 200 capital crimes, including stealing more than 5 shillings, detrimentant, a fishpond being, in the company of gypsies for multiple months. Chopping down a tree. Pickpocketing. This method was once often called the bloody code, where even minor crimes might affect in hanging. By way of Queen Victoria's accession in 1837, some of these laws had been repealed. However, many remained. Executions weren't just punishments, they had been ethical classes, enforced in front of crowds as large because the Thames. 2. Execution as theatre. Public executions had been viewed each amusement and deterrence. Held early in the morning to manipulate crowds. Of bodies left hanging for our superiors, offered execution broadsheets with poems and last phrases. Criminals grew to become folk heroes, or villains. Gang wasn't consistently solemn. Jeering, pickpocketing, even deaths through trampling befell. Some executions drew 20,000 to 30,000 persons, chiefly if the case worried scandal, love, or politics. Part 2. Crimes worth dying for. 1. What bought you hanged? By using the mid-1800s, the number of capital crimes had decreased. However, execution was once still used for homicide, treasoners, and in royal dockyards, repository, with violence, forgery. Until 1836, however, choices diversified with the aid of type, gender, and public interest. A poor man possibly hanged for theft, even as a gentleman might obtain transportation to Australia. 2. Noted execution circumstances. Maria and Frederick Manning, 1849, hanged collectively for murdering Maria's lover. She wore black silk to the gallows. Thousands came to watch, together with Charles Dickens, who condemned the spectacle in the press. Sarah Dasley, 1843, poisoned 2 husbands and a baby. Known as the pattern poisoner, she used to be the last girl hanged in Bedfordshire. John Towell, 1845, murdered his mistress, making use of prussic acid. Caught utilizing the new telegraph method. One of the vital first contemporary criminal chasers, William Palmer, 1856, a healthcare professional who poisoned a number of 4 coverage cash. The press labeled him the Rugly Poisoner, and his case bowled over Britain. Section 3. The equipment of death. 1. The gallows. A common execution gadget was the long drop gallows, designed to break the neck immediately. Earlier than that, the brief drop mainly resulted in strangulation lasting a number of minutes. Executioners like William Calcraft or James Berry became notorious figures. Calcraft liked quick drops, inflicting long, painful deaths. Berry, a reformer, experimented with precision drops for swift, humane executions. They were paid per execution and regularly carried out, 1,000s for the period of their careers. 2. The role of the executioner. the executioner used to be both feared and ridiculed. His job was once brutal, and frequently he was spat at or attacked, denied lodging, or ingredients lived in isolation, required to experiment the gallows with sandbags. Matching the prisoner's weight. Some executioners, like Calcraft, have been rumored to experience their work, others resigned, unable to or living with it. Section 4. Females and the gallows. 1. Women on loss of life. Rothau. Females have been a minority among the condemned. Their executions drew significant attention. Society used to be each interested and horrified. Expenditures that led women to the scaffold. Infanticide, killing a newborn, poisoning husband, Sanhegwe. Theft. Infrequent executions had been made extra theatrical. Females were hanged in clothes, in general white or black, given specified privacy measures, however, still viewed through crowds, the subject of romanticized reports and cautionary tales. 2. Double standards. A lady killing her child may be obvious as mad or tragic. At the same time, a man probably judged basically evil. This resulted in sympathy-founded reprievist tentant. Utilization of madness. Please debate about whether ladies might really intend murder in time. Many ladies sentenced to demise had been commuted to lifestyles in prison or asylum confinement. Part V. The commencing of the top authorized reforms. 1. Abolition of public executions. 1868. The Capital Punishment Amendment Act of 1868 was a watershed moment. From then on, executions have been to be conducted privately inside of jail. Partitions witnessed simplest through officers, clergy, and selected journalists hidden from public view to revive dignity and lower riots. Charles Dickens and different reformers celebrated this variation, although others feared it could lessen deterrence. 2. Execution procedure after 1868. After the reform, the prisoner was awakened at daybreak, given an ultimate meal and prayer, led quietly to the scaffold. Normally inside the prison yard, the executioner measured the drop cautiously. A physician demonstrated dying bodies have been buried in unmarked jail graves, routinely dissected for medical science. Part 6. Capital punishment and the class divide. 1. Justice for the wealthy versus the terrible Victorian capital punishment was deeply classist. Negative defendants had no protection. Lawyers' trials have been speedy, most of the time less than an hour. Wealthy participants used influence to prevent the gallows. Forgery was a capital crime until 1836, but when bankers solid records, they were customarily pardoned or exiled, whilst terrible women forging wage slips have been hanged. 2. The press and public newspapers fueled public sympathy that led to reprieves. Eliza Fenning Muyoitosensi Kingsley, accused of poisoning her employers. Many believed her harmless. Franz Muller Ibar Leo Sid, German tailor, accused of homicide. His trial infected xenophobic tension. The Mannings, 1849, finished after a media frenzy. They grew to become tabloid sensations. Public opinion more and more influenced justice, a signal that society was questioning the morality of execution itself. Section 7. Beyond the gallows. Alternatives to death. 1. Transportation to the colonies for lesser capital crimes. The punishment probably commuted to transportation, most commonly to Australia, New South Wales, Van Diemen's Land, Bermuda, or Gibraltar. For Navy labour, sentences ranged from 7 years to existence, with tough labour conditions had been brutal. Chained voyages, harsh climates, ailment, isolation. Transportation used to be visible as merciful in comparison with hanging, but used to be still a life sentence in exile. 2. Penal servitude. Through the 1850s, many transported convicts remained in Britain's new penal servitude system, which included difficult labour, treadmills, oakum picking, quarry work, solitary confinement, silent programs. This mirrored a shift in Victorian penal pondering. Punishment must reform, not just get rid of. Part 8. The ultimate century of the death penalty, one towards abolition with the aid of the late Victorian technology. Critics argued execution didn't deter crime. The innocent might be killed, the state should not kill. Still, capital punishment remained for homicide well into the 20th century. The final lady hanged in Britain was once Ruth Ellis. In 1955, the last man was Peter Allen. In 1964, capital punishment was finally abolished. In 1965, homicide, and formally in all circumstances by way of 1998.2 Victorian effect on cutting Justice thought brutal by means of trendy requirements. The Victorian generation helped reshape justice, decreased capital crimes, ended public executions, pioneered forensic science and media. Scrutiny sparked ethical debate about justice and morality. Gallows that once stood in public squares are gone, but their shadows stay in trendy arguments over the death penalty worldwide. Conclusion: a symbol of justice or a device of terror. To Victorian England, the gallows used to be the superb punishment, final, public, and irreversible. But whilst they built towering scaffolds, Victorians started out questioning whether state killing was just. What started out as spectacle led to silence, with executions hidden behind jail partitions. This journey from public horror to private justice tells us no longer handiest about punishment, but about what sort of society the Victorians hoped to come to be, and possibly about what form of society we nonetheless hope to build. Opening scene: The Boy on Trial, London, 1872. A courtroom packed with curious onlookers watches as a small boy, not more than 12 years historic, stands accused of pickpocketing a lady's purse. His clothes are ragged, his eyes extensive with worry. No lawyer defends him. The magistrate, stern and unmoved, prepares to provide the sentence. This boy's fate would no longer simply form his future. It could mirror a society grappling with poverty, morality, and the limits of justice for its youngest and most vulnerable. Section I. Childhood in Victorian England, a harsh reality. 1. The myth of innocence. Today's society normally views children as innocent and included. Victorian England had an awfully distinct understanding. Childhood was a transitional stage, and generally a time when survival used to be paramount. Many children began working via age 6 or 7 in factories, mines, or as road vendor. Schooling was once not compulsory, except 1870. So many youngsters had been illiterate or poorly schooled. Poverty pressured kids into begging, theft, and other determined acts. Too many Victorians, especially the upper and centre classes, terrible youngsters, have been little criminals within the making. 2. Juvenile crime factors and context. The speedy development of cities and industrialization created a new city terrible type. Juvenile crime grew as a symptom of extreme poverty, broken households, lack of supervision or car starvation, and desperation. More juvenile crimes included pickpocketing, showgroftlift, and strolling far away from residents. Vandalism. Youngsters have been hardly ever noticeable as victims of circumstance. As a substitute, many had been handled as deliberate lawbreakers. Part 2. The juvenile justice approach and rising self-discipline. 1. Early responses. Punishment over reform. Bare mid-century reforms. Children accused of crimes had been tried in adult courts to the identical prisons and punishments as adults, together with tough labor and corporal punishment, subjected to public humiliation and flogging. The regulation handled little one offenders harshly, believing that worry and self-discipline would avert future crime. 2. The birth of adolescent courts. First significant reform came with the institution of separate juvenile courts within the late 19th century, most in particular the Youngster Courtroom at Bow Avenue in 1902, though previous experiments existed within the 1880s. These courts emphasized rehabilitation and moral instruction, warding off stigmatizing children with the aid of treating them otherwise from adults in offenders in reformatories or industrial schools rather of prison. These reforms were gradual and patchy in implementation. Part 3. Reformatories and industrial colleges. Associations for young offenders. 1. Prison faculties founded under the Youthful Offenders Act of 1854. Reformatories aim to separate convicted children from hardened criminals for niche vocational training and ethical education, still disciplined by means of regimented routines. Legislation in reformatories was once strict, generally harsh, and heavily regimented. Work incorporated agriculture, carpentry, and tailoring. The success of these associations diversified, with many children subjected to punitive measures disguised as education. 2. Industrial facultist Economic Colleges Act of 1857 involved in children deemed uncared for or past parental control, preventative intervention earlier than they committed crimes. These faculties operated like reformatories, but took children by and large on the mere suspicion they would offend. Conditions have been commonly bleak. Corporal punishment was customary. Overcrowding and negative sanitation ended in ailment outbreaks. Youngsters quite often faced emotional and bodily dissection. 4. The role of corporal punishment. 1. Flogging and caning. Corporal punishment was activities in Victorian juvenile justice. Flogging with birch rods or canes was administered for disobedience. Did get away. Minor offences comparable to truancy or combating punishments would be public, supposed as deterrence for others, and have been most commonly brutal. 2. The debate over bodily self-discipline. Critics, including reformers like Mary Chippy and Ellen Wood, argued that corporal punishment hardened youngsters instead than reformed them, precipitated lasting psychological trauma. Was once ineffective in stopping recidivism. Victorian society mostly accredited bodily punishment as a critical evil. Section V. Noted circumstances and public reactions. 1. The Boy Jones, William Jones, referred to as the Boy Jones, many times broke into Buckingham Palace between 1838 and 1841 as a little one. His notoriety captivated London. His punishments included time in reformatories, imprisonment as a grown-up after repeated offences. His story highlighted society's failure to rehabilitate juvenile offenders and the fascination with youthful criminals. 2. The homicide of Sarah Smith in 1867. 14-year-old Thomas Reed was tried for the homicide of Sarah Smith, a case that bowled over the public and raised questions about the moral culpability of children. Reed was sentenced to loss of life. However, public outcry resulted in commutation to lifestyles imprisonment. Part 6. The function of poverty and social reform. 1. Hyperlinks between poverty and juvenile crime. Studies in the Victorian technology increasingly linked juvenile crime. 2. Negative housing conditions, malnutrition, lack of education, parental forget, or alcoholism. Reformers argued that addressing social reasons was main for lowering crime. 2. Schooling Acts and Prevention. The Basic Schooling Act of 1870 began to make schooling obligatory, a principal step towards preventing juvenile crime by way of retaining kids off the streets, teaching ethical values and literacy, delivering alternatives to crime. Yet many working-type children nonetheless labored during the day or skipped college to support families. Part 7. The legacy of Victorian juvenile justice. 1. The shift from punishment to rehabilitation. Via the end of the 19th century, Victorian England had laid the groundwork for a process that viewed juvenile offenders otherwise from adults, focusing on schooling, moral steerage, social reintegration. 2. Carrying on with challenge regardless of reforms. Children ordinarily remained caught between harsh authorized systems and social forget about the stigmatization of teenage offenders endured, and poverty remained a driving drive in the back of a lot juvenile crime. Conclusion. Childhood on trial. Victorian England's medication of teeny bopper offenders reflects a society struggling to reconcile justice with compassion, order with mercy, and punishment with reform. While early laws have been harsh and ordinarily merciless, the gradual emergence of teeny bopper courts and reformatories signaled a developing consciousness of kids' exact wishes. Yet, behind each statistic was a baby like the boy in the dock, prone, scared, and caught in a procedure nonetheless, learning tips on how to protect its youngest participants. Chapter 9. The upward push of policing, law enforcement and social manage in Victorian England. Opening scene. The nighttime watch and the beginning of the Bobby. London 1829. On the fog-encumbered streets, a new sort of determined strides that beat a uniformed officer carrying a tall helmet and carrying a This is one of the metropolis's first bobbies, part of a bold scan by using dwelling secretary Sir Robert Peel to tame the chaos of urban life. The nighttime watchman, ineffective and corrupt, had been giving approach to official force, tasked with crime prevention, order protection, and the typically contentious manage of the working classes. Part 1. The ailment of early Victorian cities. 1. City chaos and crime. Industrial revolution spurred speedy growth in cities like London, Manchester, and Birmingham. Problems included overcrowding in slums and tenements, rampant poverty and unemployment, public drunkenness and brawling, rising premiums of theft, assault, and prostitution. Existing procedure of parish constables, watchmen, and volunteer thief was once insufficient, normally corrupt or bribed. 2. The failure of historical policing methods. Bare formal police forces, Parish constables have been unpaid, and phase-time watchmen have been poorly informed. By and large, asleep on duty fakers operated as bounty hunters. Customarily in league with criminals, the justice procedure was gradual, and inefficient crime went generally unchecked, fueling worry and disease. Section 2. The Metropolitan Police, Act 18,291. Sir Robert Peel and the delivery of today's policing. Sir Robert Peel, aiming to scale down crime and reform justice, founded the Metropolitan Police Force for London in 1829 with standards together with prevention of crime, because the essential intentioned police, as neutral servants of the regulation officers to hold, public believe, prevent force unless imperative accountability and professionalism. The force began with simply over 1,000 officers, patrolling walking in marked uniforms. 2. Public reception and suspicion. Many in London feared the brand new police. As a standing military threatening liberty, critics called them peelers or bobbies, mocking their uniforms and discipline. Riots in opposition to police were original in early years, especially among working category communities suspicious of presidency manipulate. Part 3. Constitution and performance of the Victorian Police. 1. Institution and ranks. The drive was hierarchical. Commissioners and superintendents managed administration's agents, supervised constables on the beat. Constables conducted patrols, arrests, and investigations. 2. Obligations and powers. Policing, excited about stopping crime by means of scene presence, arresting suspects, patrolling streets and public movements, imposing public morality, legal guidelines, e.g. against prostitution, drunkenness, maintaining order in the course of protests and strikes. Victorian police also acted as social workers, serving to misplaced youngsters and the destitute, although usually with suspicion. Section 4. Policing crime investigations and challenges. 1. Early detective work. Detectives emerged later, peculiarly in the detective branch founded 1842, tackling theft and burglary, rings, fraud and forgery, political conspiracies, and espionage. Early detectives relied heavily on informants, surveillance, and neighborhood talents. 2. Boundaries and corruption. Police faced challenges including restrained forensic science. Fingerprints weren't used except the 1890s. Corruption and bribery inside ranks. Public distrust, especially in poorer districts. Jurisdictional conflicts with neighborhood magistrates and private securities. Section V. Policing. Social manage. 1. The police and the working lessons. Victorian police traditionally served as instruments of social control, especially towards strikers and labor organizers, political radicals, and anarchist sex workers, and vagrants, ethnic minorities, and immigrants. Their function accelerated past crime combating to enforcing category hierarchies. 2. First-rate policing movements. The suppression of the Chartist movement protests in the 1830s and 1840, sparking up street riots for the period of meals shortages, raids on brothels and gambling dens. These actions routinely sparked violent clashes and accusations of police brutality. Part 6. Famous Victorian police circumstances. 1. The case of the Whitechapel murders between 1888 and 1891. London's East End used to be terrorized by a serial killer, often called Jack the Ripper. The Metropolitan Police performed intensive investigations, though the killer used to be never caught. Confronted criticism for incompetence and poor family members with East End communities, highlighted limitations of forensic science and investigative approaches of the Generation 2. The Tichborne Claimant Trial, 1871 to 1874. This excessive profile case concerned the police investigating Arthur Orton, a person claiming to be the misplaced heir of the Tichborne loved ones. It became a sensational court docket drama involving large detective work, public fascination with identity and fraud, confirmed police function in civil as good as crook matters. Part 7. The evolution of policing approaches. 1. Advances in technology. Policing saw beginnings of crime scene pictures, use of ballistics and early forensics, establishment of fingerprint bureaus with the aid of centuries. These laid foundations for brand new investigative strategies. 2. Community policing and public family members. Bobbies had been expected to be approachable and familiar to their beats, obvious as part of the community. As an alternative, the not resourcefully helped with social services like discovering employment or lodging. This perfect customarily clashed with harsh realities on the streets. Part 8. Legacy and have an effect on 1. Policing as a latest university way of the top of the Victorian era. Policing had converted from a patchwork of casual programs to a legit, geared-up force that decreased avenue crime in urban centre, elevated public defence and order headquartered specifications for accountability and self-discipline too. Ongoing controversiists prims continued. Police violence and sophistication bias, an intrusion on civil liberties balancing crime prevention with respect for rights. These debates, rooted in Victorian times, proceed in policing discourse today. Conclusion. The bobbies beat order in an age of Tradethia. Rise of policing in Victorian England reflected the technology's complicated challenges: urbanisation, industrialisation, social upheaval. The Metropolitan Police, born from reformist beliefs and useful necessity, grew to be a model for today's regulation enforcement global. Yet policing also raised difficult questions about authority, power, and justice, questions that resonate from the gaslit streets of Victorian London to our possessed cities today. Chapter 10. The legal trials that bowled over a nation. Notorious. Victorian court circumstances. Opening scene. The courtroom in frenzy. London, 1888. The packed court buzzes with anticipation because the prosecution prepares to put out damning proof towards the accused. Spectators lean ahead, keen for each twist and revelation. This isn't just a trial, it's a countrywide spectacle. The clique camps outside, newshounds scribble furiously, and gossip spreads like wildfire. Victorian England was fascinated with court instances, especially these involving homicide, scandal, or high society. These trials weren't in simple terms legal complaints. They were public dramas that revealed the fears, prejudices, and values of an age. Part 1. The energy of the Victorian courtroom. 1. The courtroom as theatre. Victorian trials in general played out like theatrical productions, crowded courtrooms filled with spectatrix larias, supplying dramatic speeches, witnesses examined and move-examined below severe scrutiny. Defendants, displayed as villains or victims, thick amplified these dramas, publishing transcripts, caricatures, and sensational deaths, influencing public opinion. 2. The position of class and gender. Court outcomes most commonly mirrored social biases. Higher class defendants by and large bought more lenient treatments. Females, certainly these accused of ethical crimes, have been judged harshly but additionally romanticized. The terrible confronted harsh penalties and restricted legal aids. Dynamics had been noticeable in lots of high-profile instances. Part 2. The case of Florence Maybrick. 1889. 1. The details. Maybrick, an American-born lady, used to be accused of poisoning her rich husband, James Maybrick, with arsenic. Key factors: marital strife and infidelity. Rumors: James's declining well-being and mysterious signs. Florence's alleged purchase of arsenic for medicinal functions. 2. The trial and controversy. Florence's trial used to be a sensation. The prosecution argued she killed her husband to escape abuse. At the same time, Safeguard claimed innocence. She was convicted and sentenced to demise. However, public outcry led to a commutation to lifestyle's imprisonment. Debate over her guilt persevered for decades, making her a symbol of the gendered justice system. Part 3. The case of the tick-borne claimant. 1871-1874. 1. The mystery. The tick-borne household heir, presumed misplaced at sea, was claimed by way of Arthur Orton, a butcher's son from Wapping, who insisted he was Sir Roger Tichborne. 2. The legal drama. The trial grew to be one of the crucial, longest and most pricey of the century, presenting excessive scrutiny of Orton's identity. Witnesses for and against. Public fascination with classification and identification. Orton was eventually convicted of perjury. The case highlighted Victorian anxieties about identification, category mobility, and fraud. Section 4. The homicide of Dr. Thomas Cream. 1891. The crime. Dr. Thomas Cream, known as the Lambeth Poisoner, was once accused of killing a couple of victims with poison, quite often for financial reap. 2. The trial. His case bowled over London due to the brutality and calculation of the crimes. His reliable status as a healthcare professional abused for murder. Use of emerging forensic science in evidence presentation. Cream was convicted and completed, but his crimes lingered in public memory as cautionary memories of reputable belief betrayed. Section V. The case of Oscar Wilde. 18951. The history. Oscar Wilde, celebrated playwright and creator, used to be delivered to trial for gross indecency because of his gay relationships unlawful beneath. Victorian Regulation. 2. The trials Wilde first sued the Marquis of Queensberry for libel, but evidence in opposition to Wilde emerged. Wilde used to be arrested, tried twice, and ultimately convicted, sentenced to 2 years of difficult labour. His well-being and profession ruined the trial, uncovered Victorian society's hypocrisy, repression, and moral panic. Part 6. Public reaction and the media. 1. Sensationalism and ethical classes. Victorian newspapers thrived on scandalous trials, often editorializing and swaying public opinion. Pamphlets and penny dreadfuls capitalized on lurid important points. Trials had been framed as moral classes, or warnings clicking might make or destroy reputations. 2. The affect unauthorized reform. Public curiosity in infamous instances compelled lawmakers to improve proof requirements, furnish higher legal representation, reform harsh punishments. Sensational. These cases also spark serious debates about justice. Part 7. Legal improvements and challenges. 1. Forensic science emerges. Victorian trials saw early use of chemical assessments for poisons, ballistics, and handwriting evaluation adduced testimonies. Advances commenced to convert regulation from guesswork to science. 2. The function of the drawn from the general public have been influenced by social prejudices, media, insurance policy, emotional appeals. Their verdicts normally reflected societal attitudes more than facts. Section 8. The legacy of Victorian court docket. Drama. 1. Trials. As cultural touchstones, these instances became topics of books, plays, and later movies, markers of societal alternate mirrors of Victorian anxieties about classification, gender, and morality. 2. State-of-the-art parallels. The Victorian court docket's combination of spectacle, justice, and media influence resonates with today's excessive profile trials and authorized controversies. Conclusion. Justice, spectacle, and society. Victorian England's infamous trials disclose a justice approach on the crossroads, grappling with fairness, public scrutiny, and evolving social values. They show how the court docket can end up each a situation of truth and a stage for drama, reflecting the hopes and fears of a changing nation. Chapter 11. Debt, dungeons, and debtors. Prisons, monetary crime and punishment. In the Victorian technology opening scene, the iron gates of Marshalsea Prison, London, 1845. A person in threadbare clothes shuffles via the mud external Marshalsea Prison. His eyes are sunken, his hands trembling. He isn't a hardened crook, he's a debtor, caught in the unforgiving grip of Victorian fiscal legislation. Families discuss with behind bars, children play in grim courtyards, and the stench of despair hangs heavy. This was once the cruel truth for thousands imprisoned, not for theft or violence, however, for the failure to repay money owed. Part 1. The origins of debtors' prisons. 1. Historical background. Debtors' prisons existed lengthy before Victorian times, but the Industrial Revolution and the rise of capitalism intensified their use. Debtors had been noticeable as ethical failures, dependable for his or her smash credit, and borrowing expanded with expanding exchange and purchaser culture. Legal guidelines made non-payment to crook often synodicated. Prisons like Marshalsea, Fleet, and the King's Bench became synonymous with poverty and struggling. 2. Who was imprisoned? Prisoners included small shopkeepers and laborers unable to pay, debt center classification gurus who had overextended themselves as fimals, kids, and whole families typically detained with the debtor. The imprisonment was indefinite, lasting until the debt used to be paid or arrangements made. Section 2. Existence inside of debtors' prisons. 1. Stipulations and day-to-day life. Prisons were overcrowded and filthy, with bad sanitation and rampant disease. House elves living in cramped cells. Prisoners required to pay for his or her own food, bedding, and lodging. Debt collectors and jailers quite often exploiting inmates for bribes. 2. Work and privilege. Prisoners would work external to jail for the duration of the day, or run corporations from inside. However, most had been trapped in a cycle of poverty. Kids, in general, suffered alongside mum and dad. Breakout used to be rare and damaging. Section 3. Authorized framework and enforcement. 1. Laws governing debtors have been arrested after courtroom judgments requiring fee. Creditor petitions failure to appear in courtroom and imprisoned. They had little legal recourse. Point 2. The position of the courts and collectors scrutiators would petition for debtors, arrest impact prison stipulations controlled terms of unlock through fee agreements. This energy dynamic used to be highly skewed in opposition to debtors. Section 4. Famous circumstances and cultural have an effect on one. Charles Dickens in the Marshalsea. Dickens's father was imprisoned in Marshalsea, deeply influencing his work. In Little Dorrit, Dickens portrays the jail's brutal realities and the social stigma connected to debt. 2. The case of the pauper prisoners. Many prisoners were trapped through minor money owed from everyday scientific bills or surprising financial crisis and fair interest rates and authorized expenses. Their plight highlighted systemic injustices. Part 5. Criticism and reform movements. 1. Campaigns in opposition to debtors. Prisons reformers argued imprisonment was once counterproductive. Debtors couldn't earn two pay stipulations had been inhumane. Wall. Households suffered unjustly. Figures like John Howard and Elizabeth Fry encouraged for exchange. Point 2. Legislative alterations. Reforms incorporated. Debtors Act, 1869, abolished imprisonment for most money owed, besides fraud or willful refusal to pay. Shift towards bankruptcy legal guidelines and insolvency court cases. Expansion of credit law. These reforms slowly ended the technology of debtors' prisons. Section 6. Monetary crime and harsh punishments. 1. Fraud, embezzlement, and forgery. Victorians handled economic crime severely. Forgery was once a capital offense. Except 1836, embezzlement and fraud could result in jail or transportation. Scandals shook public belief in commerce. 2. Punishments for economic offenses. Punishments ranged from fines and imprisonment, public humiliation, pillory, transportation to penal colonies, execution in infrequent instances of serious fraud. Part 7. The social and financial legacy. 1. The stigma of debt. Fiscal failure carried deep social shame, affecting marriage prospects, employment possibilities, social standing, and family honor. 2. Influence on Victorians. The tithe, harsh therapy of debtors, highlighted the technologies, anxiety between rising capitalist economic climate and normal social values, challenges of balancing justice with financial realities, growing consciousness of the necessity for more humane, authorized, and economic techniques. Conclusion. From dungeons to reform. The decline of debtors. Prisons. Victorian debtors. Prisons characterize a time when monetary misfortune was once criminalized, and poverty used to be punished with imprisonment. The struggling of numerous guys, ladies, and kids in the back of iron gates spurred a sluggish but significant transformation in legislation and society. By means of the tip of the 19th century, debtor imprisonment had generally ended, changed, with the aid of new methods aiming to reconcile monetary hazard with human dignity. Chapter 12. Females and the Law, Gender, Justice, and Punishment in Victorian England. Opening scene. The court docket and the girl defendant. In London, 1865. A girl stands in the dock, wearing black, her face pale however resolute. She is accused of a significant crime, probably homicide, theft, or infanticide. The courtroom is silent, eyes constant on her. Victorian society watches, involved and divided. Can a girl be real criminal, or is she a victim of circumstance? In the Victorian era, legal guidelines and punishments for females had been shaped by using gender roles, social expectations, and vicious realities, revealing a justice system deeply influenced by way of cultural notions of femininity and morality. Section I. Victorian gender roles and legal popularity. 1. The angel in the house. Ideal Victorian society idealized women as pure, submissive, and devoted to household, morally superior but fragilely accountable for maintaining social order by way of domesticity. Excellent, sharply contrasted with the cruel therapy females would acquire below the law. 2. Legal restrictions for mills. Authorized rights were restrained. Below, a married lady's property and authorized identity belonged to her husband. Ladies had restrained rights to possess property, vote, or enter contracts. Divorce was once complex and stigmatized, favoring guys in custody and property disputes. This made females prone both socially and legally. Part 2. Crimes customarily related to females. 1. Infanticidian of the tragic and commonplace crimes. Terrible females, especially single moms, faced determined occasions. Fanticide was once oftentimes obvious as a hidden crime because of stigma, The regulation treated it harshly, though juries repeatedly confirmed sympathy to theft and shoplifting. Ladies, mainly impoverished, frequently turned to theft. Small-scale shoplifting used to be normal punishments, incorporated imprisonment, hard labor, or transportation. The criminal justice method mostly viewed women as fallen. However, read Prostitution and Vagrants Illegal Guidelines criminalizing prostitution, particular ladies, harshly. The Contagious Illnesses Acts 1864-1866, 1869 allowed forced medical examination. Women faced arrest, public shaming, and institutionalization. These acts sparked fierce opposition, specifically via Josephine Butler and others. Part 3. Punishments and Prisons for Females. 1. Feminine prisons and workhouse. Women had been incarcerated separately. However, conditions remained brutal. Overcrowding and bad sanitation, forced labor comparable to stitching or washing. Moral guide alongside punishment. Workhouses served as each terrible comfort and detention facilities for idle or vagrant women. 2. Transportation and sentencing. Women convicted of great crimes probably transported to penal colonies, often facing harsher conditions than men sentenced to hard labor. Although mainly much less bodily demanding duties, sentencing in most cases mirrored today's strategies about protecting females as delicacy. Part 4. Remarkable female crook circumstances. 1. The Patan poisoner Sarah Dasley. Dasley poisoned two husbands and a youngster in the 1840s. Her case captivated public creativeness because of its scandal and horror. Raised questions about feminine agency and evil, resulted in her execution in 1843, highlighting the boundaries of Victorian mercy. 2. Florence Maybrick, mentioned in Chapter 10. Her trial underscored gender bias in accusations of murder. 3. The case of Elizabeth Brown Rigay, brutal little one, abuser. Her conviction greatly surprised Victorian England and challenged assumptions about females as nurturing roles. Part 5. Ladies' rights and authorized reform movements. 1. The combat towards the contagious ailments. Activists, together with Josephine Butler, campaigned to repeal these acts because of violations of ladies' rights and dignity and equitable treatment in comparison with men, highlighting the hypocrisy of Victorian morality. Their success in repealing the acts in 1886 marked a giant legal victory. 2. The females' suffrage motional. Though ordinarily excited by balloting rights, suffragists also sought authorized reforms in property, marriage, and little one custody. Accelerated therapy in the crook justice process, higher social and economic possibility. Legal milestones. Key legislative changes integrated Married Ladies' Property Acts, 1870, 1882, enabling property ownership. Custody of Infants Act, 1839, giving mums constrained custody rights. Gradual reforms, making improvements to females as authorized status. Part 6. The intersection of class and gender. 1. Center category versus working category. Females. The justice process dealt with females in a different way, established on category, center, and higher type. Ladies' crimes have been normally minimized or hidden. Working females confronted harsher punishments and social stigma. Poverty extended vulnerability to crime and prosecution. 2. The function of morality. Ladies' criminal activity used to be most commonly framed as a moral failing, with religious and social expectations influencing authorized outcomes. Section 7. Legacy of Victorian females and the legislation. 1. The changing role of females. Victorian authorized reforms laid groundwork for the eventual extension of suffrage. Legal autonomy, realization of ladies' rights inside and past the justice procedure. 2. Carrying on with challenges despite progress. Victorian generation gender biases continued, influencing regulation, enforcement, prosecution, and sentencing for a long time. Conclusion. Between angel and crook, Victorian women's difficult authorized journey. Victorian women navigated a legal world formed by using restrictive gender roles, harsh punishments, and rising reforms. Their experiences replicate both oppression and resilience, illuminating the intersections of gender, category, and justice. As society evolved, these tensions lead the way for ultra-modern legal rights and the continued battle for gender equality.